call. Gordon Brockway,
Present.
Scott Hopkinson,
Present.
David Hessel,
Present.
myself, Mark Howell, and Gail Heyer is absent, at least at the moment. So given that, this meeting is being recorded. Members of the public will be given an opportunity to comment towards the end of our agenda. The agenda is posted on the town website along with some supplementary materials. So I'd encourage all the task force members to bring that up. And first order of business, we do need to name a clerk for this meeting. Sorry, I was just getting a little background noise here, so I muted for a minute. Do I have a volunteer to take clerk duties for the moment? I know you guys are thrilled for this job.
I really would prefer not to because I'm already the clerk on the light board.
I understand.
I already owe you minutes.
Yes. And Scott, you were on mute, and I think you tried to say something.
Well, I was begging off in the similar way, basically, because I haven't turned in the last minutes. But if you want me to, I will do it again, I guess. I'll just.
Okay, let's go with that. And we can, if Gail does get here, although I believe she may be at a remote location, we could ask her if she'd be willing to take a turn, but I appreciate it. I know it's a bit of a lift. Okay.
Yeah, I apologize. I mean, I think we're all very busy. I just got back from Boston like 10 minutes ago.
Great. Okay.
Yeah,
And
whatever.
we don't have any additional minutes to review for this meeting. I know that there's a first draft of the September 23rd minutes that's getting a little reworked by David, and last week's minutes are not available yet. So what I'm proposing we do now is dive right into sort of a continued discussion of the focus areas. I took the document that we had been looking at last week, which is linked in the agenda for anybody who cares to follow along, called Focus Area Definitions, and included it in the agenda for today's meeting. So anyone that downloads that package from the website can see it. And that, yes, that's attached after the agenda. And it's listed as, I believe it begins on page 4, right after the reference materials. And it includes the document as it evolved through our discussions last week. And I might suggest that we may want to revisit it, or we could move on to the next section. Just a reminder, it contains 4 sections. The attempt was to both define the meaning of these key phrases listed as under section A, B, and C here, as the last 5 to 7% of the streets, the barriers to subscription growth, fiber to the home, fiber to the business, and to identify, if possible, any other areas that we may want to continue. So I guess I'll pause there. Did anyone have any additional thoughts in the last week that they would like to introduce or include in the discussion of those areas and definitions? So everybody have a copy of it in front of them to look at if they want to. Okay, good. All right. Seeing none then, what I'm going to suggest we do is move to the second part of number 3, which begins with data requests. And what I attempted to do here for your consideration is to begin to try to identify the data that we would actually be asking for. And I might mention here that Greg Marcinek, the telecom director, did reach out to me after last week's meeting and provided a list, an Excel spreadsheet actually, with a list of what he has identified as streets with no access. And that's included on pages 7 and 8 of the agenda. And it's a preliminary list, but I thought it was useful to gain a sense of what information is available. And he offered to to share that and work with us to develop the information. I actually responded to him, thanking him for his efforts, and also saying that because, as we previously discussed, we want to try to be as low impact as possible on staff time. I encouraged him to sort of let us begin to develop what we really want from this in these data requests, so that we're not repeatedly asking staff to work and rework that. So, starting off of that.
Mark, can I?
Yes.
So that's all good. I'm really glad. I was hoping that someone would begin to have a conversation with Greg. I'm wondering if it would make sense, and maybe you would be the right person, or maybe you and I, if we could do that without violating open meeting laws, sit down with Greg for a few minutes and just either could be a Zoom call or whatever, and find out what's easy for him to generate as well. So it may be that there's data that, it's kind of a give and take. So maybe we should generate our first pass of the list, but also find out from him what's easy to generate. For example, one thing that I think would be very convenient is if we could get, subscriptions, when they occurred, how long, and if they discontinued the service, when that happened, and just sort of that data at the very low level, basically. And I suspect that's something that they could export from the data that they have, but I don't know. So, and furthermore, in terms of privacy, one of the things I did in this last week is I did go look at the town database for property taxes, and I could verify that I could download property address, ownership, and name and address for every individual property owned in the town of Concord that's in our tax roll. So if there's concerns about privacy, that information is already in the public domain. I didn't have to register or log in anywhere to get it. So I'd like to find out. I mean, I think it would be worthwhile to talk to Greg and see what's easy for him to generate as part of that process.
Okay. I do think that something along those lines is probably appropriate to do. I'm hoping that we'll get to the point where we feel comfortable sort of, authorizing or assigning that the responsibility to go ask for that first pass. And so what I was thinking we might want to do is think through a little bit of what that's likely to be. I do know that it is possible to generate fairly detailed subscriber information in terms of who's on and how long, because in my previous role I used to run reports like that that helped document the growth of the system. So that some of that is available through the billing system. I think it's a very good question for us to ask, is what's useful in service of the ultimate goal that we have, which is to facilitate planning and policy associated with building out the fiber. We could spend a lot of time in subscriber data, and in my way of thinking, maybe even get ourselves kind of off track if we do that. Although, granted, in area C, where we talk about barriers to growth, some understanding of that is important. Yes, Gordon.
Yeah, I'm wondering. Well, okay. So when I heard you use the word, Mark, authorize.
Yeah.
And actually, Scott, I think you said something similar. The idea is that we'll, peel a couple of members of this task force off, authorize them, and then have a conversation with broadband staff. And personally, I mean, that's certainly doable. But I think that it would be better if the staff is willing and town management is willing to let them, to invite them to a meeting. And that way we wouldn't be depending on a selected subset
No, that sounds fine.
to think
Yeah.
things through and get all the questions right and so forth. There is some strength in numbers. I understand there's pros and cons to everything, but I sort of lean towards openness and transparency.
No,
On the other side, I'm sorry, I'm thinking out loud. Not everything rises to the level of a deliberation, and if it's such granular data, like Mark, you just said, pulling reports. It's like, what should the SQL command be, or something like that? That definitely doesn't rise to the level of a committee discussion. But anyway, the other thing is maybe I'm broaching something that's worth considering in the short tenure of this meeting. Is at what point do we want to engage, and how do we want to engage with staff and leadership?
Mhm. I think those are good questions. In fact, frankly, the quicker we get to them, the better, because as we were chatting about, we don't have much time for this effort. And I think that your point's well taken in terms of deliberation and understanding what's in. I think of it as two tasks. One is get the data, get a report, and get something that we can distribute and look at. And the other one is having a discussion about what it means, and maybe whether there are subsequent questions that result from that. The second part of that, I completely agree, is probably best handled in a meeting where we invite Greg and give the whole task force the opportunity to ask the questions in a public setting. In terms of the mechanics of how to get at some of this information, I would feel very comfortable going and having a specific conversation with you can get this data here and that data there. One of the interesting points about this is that he even mentioned in his email, and I know you were copied on that, Gordon, that the GIS department, which is actually part of IT, is the keeper of quite a bit of this information, especially the parcels and so forth. And so there are definitely two different town departments that will need to collaborate, I believe, in order to help us accomplish the data. And I'm just going to pause and recognize that Gail Heyer is in the process of joining us. Hi, Gail. And we'll see whether she can. Can you hear us okay? We can't hear you yet. Hi, Gail. Just trying to see whether she's.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hi.
Heard you for a second. There you go. Yeah.
Yeah, I just had to join the audio thing. Sorry, I'm late.
Oh, that's okay. We're talking about to sort of talk about the data request part. So we're on down in the agenda, section 3. So I mentioned that, the town telecom director had provided us with this list of streets with no access, which I think is a good starting point. And for the public, I think it's useful to know that there are sort of 56 street areas around town and some of them are the entire street. I believe that there's certainly some areas on this that are listed on this list, like Commonwealth and Main Business District. Obviously, there are many places that have service on both of those streets, and then there are some places that don't. And I think that's true of several of these. So the exact meanings are not completely apparent from this list, but I thought it was a useful starting point for understanding what we're talking about when we say streets. People who live on these streets, I think, are usually pretty well aware of the limitation. So we were just talking about how to go about presenting the data requests, the possibility of detailing a committee member, and I would volunteer to do this, to discuss directly with town staff about the mechanics of how to do it, and then see if they could generate that data and then, get it distributed to the committee, and then maybe be in a position to ask questions or have a discussion with them about what it means in advance. And in response to this offer to help us get the data, I had encouraged him to wait, because I felt like it would be a good idea if we sort of have a package together of the things that we're looking for.
I'm sorry, you
Yes.
said you encouraged Jim or Greg?
Greg, I encouraged Greg not to
Okay.
try to generate the data that we would need until we had sort of had an opportunity to have this meeting and discuss what we're asking for, so that we wouldn't have the situation where he goes off and does some work and then we ask for something different. Now he's doing work again. It just seemed sensible to me to approach it that way.
Okay.
And consistent with what we'd already talked about. Okay. So that's the catch up. So, with that list as a starting point, and thinking about the first area that we're trying to get at, streets with no access, and possibly referencing it seemed to me that this list of streets could then include a reason code that indicates what why the street doesn't have access, or if it's a partial street, for example, numbers, I'm just making something up, 100 to 200 on, street A don't have fiber service, and as we know, some sections do and some sections don't. It seemed like it would be necessary to enhance the details there. That would be a starting point for that. There might be some other information that could be useful, like the length of the street for calculating costs or something like that. I'm open to suggestions about what else do we think we want to know about, thinking about it specifically as from the perspective of the street and the right of way, as we discussed last time. What else do we need to know to work on that portion?
So I think the information that drove the percentage of unserved properties in the warrant and all of on our charge is driven from the GIS information, right?
And the parcels, which is not the same as the roads.
Right. So I guess that was kind of my point. So maybe we should begin to think about, there's two data asks that are pending here. One is from the light plant broadband activity or side, and they'll provide a certain amount of information, and there'll be another data request to the GIS side. Do you not think?
I agree, and my suggestion is that we try to present them together, because I think they'll need to collaborate on them.
Okay.
Gail, did you have a?
Yeah, so a couple data points. One, if these streets have rules about utilities need to be underground, and that's a concern in some places. So any restrictions on placement of utilities. I guess I have to believe that everyone is on Concord Light power, so they all have electricity service, is that a safe assumption that everywhere in town has electric service?
It's,
There,
Oh.
for effectively, there may have been a very arcane exception that one corner of town that historically actually gave us access to green communities funding, but that's an aside. I think the answer to your question is yes, everybody's got it.
Okay, and then also if, it'd be good to know if people have requested fiber, if the people on those streets that don't have it, if they've asked, and because that would be useful.
okay. I think that could likely come under what I have listed later as broadband order analysis, which is review all broadband order forms, which is something that is generated at the website when people are first interested, and try to code those for completion status. So that would normally tie to a parcel. So even though we talk about streets, sort of the atomic unit of service is going to tend to be a parcel or a premise.
Okay, yeah, it makes more sense to have it in that category.
Mhm.
Data.
Can you, go ahead, David.
Well, there's another one where Miguel brings up where they requested it, but isn't there another kind of subset where I go and I find out that it's not available,
Right.
and I can't even request it?
Yes. Yes.
It's one more.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't know if you can get that information. That I want it. I go to the Concord website and I make the first initial step, but it's not available.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a dead end piece of data.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I mean, one way to think of what we're doing is to generate a report. Another one is to identify pinch points like that not only in that case, not only reflects a bottleneck in rolling out service, but also is a potential blind spot in the way that management views the terrain. So I think that's a great point.
It's well, I mean, and we know it here where I live.
Yeah.
Don't waste your time, don't try it. But when it was first announced, or let me rephrase that, when I was first made aware of it, I went to the website right away and said, "Oh, it's kind of a dead end. We can't get it."
Right.
Yeah. So, and to expand on that point, you see, that's burying data. That's creating a blind spot. And so, one of the outcomes of this committee could be that we identify a bunch of places where we need better visibility at a management level, and that with that visibility, then that would help direct resources and make better decisions and decide how much money to spend and things like that.
Yeah, I do think that our recommendations are going to end up being along the lines of what policies and programs need to be created in order to support this. So if we just take this list on face value and say there are 56 sections of road throughout the town that are known to exist today for which fiber is not installed in the right of way. Our recommendation or approach to that particular subset of the problem could be, okay, what does it take to understand how much that costs? What's the decision-making process that, let's assume for the moment that those are 56 separate little projects that eventually accomplish 100% of the right-of-way is now enabled. What does it take to, what's the sort of decision-making process and programs that allow that to happen? And I think that that's what comes out of this first section, which is just an understanding of the scope and scale of it. And then what could be recommended to enable that? What's the length of the program? Is it a 5-year program, a 10-year program, or a 20-year program, or something longer that gets that particular part done? And how does that pursued? And then
I think that,
go ahead.
Yeah, that'd be a great data point. I did it on a back of an envelope, and I won't give you my answer. How many solar panels the Concord have to install in order to electrify all of their daytime usage, right?
Mhm.
It's like, it's good to have that kind of number just in the back of your head, because it gives you an idea of whether or not, solarizing everything is even doable. Answer, probably not. But yeah.
Well, I'd like
Yeah.
to back up. We kind of got away from the subject matter of what would be information that we would want to ask regarding the data of those streets that are listed that you've included in our agenda.
Yeah.
One, I'm not sure you covered this. You may have, or you may have, and I didn't understand it clearly. You talked about no fiber optic in the right of way to that particular parcel, and you talked about reasons such as streets with no access. And did you want to try and differentiate between either scenarios where whatever scenarios? I know that there was one that was out there, was the utilities were already buried and there was no additional ability to run fiber optic in the current infrastructure that was buried, so the fiber optic wasn't run in that area.
Right.
And there may be other categories and I'm not thinking of right now, but I'm just wondering if, back to that question about the data we're going to look for those segments that Greg's given us information about,
Yeah.
are those categories captured?
Yeah, my suggestion would be to let staff try to, I mean, we're talking about only 56 areas, and let them sort of characterize the reason why it doesn't exist in whatever way they currently think about it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's good.
And so in the first point under GIS data requests, we had said, request streets coded with a reason code, whatever reason they want to put down. The details, if it's partial, in other words, if it's not the entire length of a street, then where does it start and where does it stop? Which is typically done by address. So, if the first 10 addresses have access and the next 50 don't, and something like that, whatever it is. And then the number of parcels that are actually on that street, I think is very useful for tying into the next set of data, which is going back to, just as for example, we can take Concord Green because that's David's area. Main Street, which is where Concord Green is off of, is served in that area. The commercial properties right outside Concord Green on either side of Concord Green have fiber, and the fiber goes past it. So that's a single parcel on Main Street, which is not served, but within that parcel, there are, whatever it is, 200 addresses. There's 200 different premises and they're not served. And there's a different reason for that. And that kind of gets into the parcel list. So everybody that's a parcel on one of these streets that has no service is already on the parcel list. But then there are more parcels over and above that, like the parcel that is Concord Green, which are also not available. And then the question is, what's going on inside of there? And that's what the second bullet is sort of getting at, is request a parcel list with no access. In other words, all the no's on our little map, coded for, are they businesses? Are they residential? Are they both? There's parcels with no access that are just open space. Nobody lives there. So you don't really need to do anything about them, but that would give us, I think, a pretty complete list of parcels, every parcel that's not served, and we can rule out the ones that are unoccupied, obviously. The parcel ID is kind of the key that lets you tie these things together. And within a given parcel, how many addresses are, how many premises or potential customers are there, which is kind of a proxy for electric meters in a lot of cases. Not everyone, because you have some properties, obviously, where you share an electric meter and there's still multiple addresses. But that combines the postal codes and the addresses in there. And then there's a separate table that's called the master address table, which is used by the town. It was most recently updated last year, so we're in luck, for the census. And that's all of the actual premise addresses in town. And so that would, if it's an apartment building and there's 3, 4, 6 units, whatever it is, each one of them is a separate address within a parcel on a street somewhere.
May I ask a question? I don't want to take this off track, but I have to go back a little historically, and maybe somebody has the answer. Why didn't Verizon wire the town? If anybody knows. I mean, I've been told there are reasons, but I don't know the reasons are accurate.
Are you talking about Verizon Fios or
Verizon
the fiber?
Fiber.
Yeah, there's no,
The Fios.
there actually were a few, I believe, a few Verizon DSL customers.
Yeah.
And then Verizon just quit. And, maybe Scott recalls better than I do, but
Yeah.
yeah.
I'm raising my hand because I was a Verizon DSL customer for a fair period of time, but I actually don't, I didn't volunteer the answer for David's question because I don't know either, but I had heard that Verizon had assessed it from a viewpoint of the underground utilities requirements and decided not to proceed. But that could be very bad data. So I don't know what the answer is.
And I heard the same thing, Scott, that they assessed it from the ROI standpoint, that they couldn't get the return on investment, but I just wonder if anybody or somebody.
I mean,
okay.
Well,
yeah.
And I don't want to divert too much here. Yeah.
So I do want to back up.
Can I finish?
Sure.
I wanted to provide an answer to David's question. I think the short answer is we don't know why they didn't decide to roll out their Fios service to residences and businesses in Concord. I will say that Verizon actually does have a certain amount of fiber in town and does provide fiber-based telecom services to certain entities. Interestingly, including some of the ISPs that are used by the town upstream's connection to. So the Concord Light Broadband, at least one of the upstream providers, last I knew about it, was using a fiber service, at least from Verizon, because Verizon has a fiber capability mostly in the business areas. So Fios and fiber are not, we tend to use them interchangeably, but they're not the same thing. And, they made a lot of decisions in a lot of parts of the country about where they would put Fios and where they don't. I'll let you go in a moment, Gordon. Generally across the industry, it's understood that at some point, they had been building a lot of Fios capability and not getting a lot of customers. And so they made kind of an overall business decision that they were going to focus on the areas where they'd already built Fios and build up the customer base, which is kind of an understandable decision. Yes, Gordon.
I wanted to make 2 points. One is directly related, and that is, I like what you just said, Scott. I think that the undergrounding is a bit of sort of an irritant. I think, I don't recall whether it was Verizon or Comcast that was reported to a light board meeting expressing frustrations about the cost and inconvenience of our undergrounding. So that could have been a contributor to the decision. Let me just say one other thing, that there's an opportunity perhaps for us to speed up deployment in those neighborhoods that are not undergrounded. Because if it's on the pole, then you don't have to dig. And we could prioritize those neighborhoods or those streets or even those residences during the winter when it's prohibitive to, anyway. So things that we can do in order to speed things up. One is that for those that use telephone-based service, we don't have to slow down.
Yeah, but Gordon, by the way, we've already, and I think it's important to continue to keep this on sort of on our front and somewhere up front, is the notion that the current residences for which the fiber does pass the premises, increasing that subscription rate there, while it doesn't directly address what is part of this initiative, it does create more cash flow and more funding, which in turn can be used to apply for this. We've talked about this a couple of different times, and I think it's something we want to make sure that when we come to our final report, that'll be something that we may want to highlight as a recommendation. So
sort of a virtuous circle.
Right, it's the, any kind of growth wheel. If we looked at one thing that we might actually analyze as part of our activity was we can analyze those homes and this might be a good discussion to have right now, of those homes that for which the fiber is at the edge of the premises, if, let's say, for conversation's sake, and I'm just going to try and do some rough numbers, we said there's 6,700 households in Concord, 20% unserved, so that's 1,200. That leaves you 5,500. And we know that the current subscription level is what, 1,200? I can't remember what the number is.
Around 17, I think.
1,700. So that leaves, for, a good 3,000 homes plus that could be served quickly. I mean, relative to, in terms of creating new infrastructure, no more than the 17 we've already done, which it could in turn generate a tremendous amount of revenue, which could then in turn fund, investing a huge amount of monies in these infrastructure places. So I think there's kind of this growth wheel piece of the thing that we might want to highlight as part of our work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
So in terms of what data we have that might be helpful at understanding that, the broadband order analysis, which is the second bullet point under
Right.
second sort of major bullet point under data requests, because we've had this facility on the website, which generates in the background a spreadsheet. When a customer who admittedly is one of the ones that the system thinks is available, has broadband available, submits a form, basically provides contact information, they are contacted by Concord Light, and then typically that results in at least a phone call, if not an appointment, where some feasibility is discussed. And at that point, the customer has the opportunity to either upgrade that initial contact to an actual order for service, which is attempted to be completed, or they may at that time choose not to order service. And so there's a pretty sizable number of people over the 7 years or whatever that this has been going who have, for one reason or another, elected not to do that. And the code, I'm not completely clear on how much coding has been done in terms of reason there, but I do know that eventually those contacts, those leads in effect, are closed out and there's a date associated with it. And so when I started thinking about that, I said we could review all the order forms and see how they're coded for completion, and if they're not coded for completion, look into what it would take to code them for completion. There's obviously some subset, 1,700 or probably 2,000 if you count, turnover and churn and so forth, that resulted in success. So they became customers and got on the system. And then there's some unknown number, I don't know how many have been done over the whole period of time, that resulted in failure. I do know that a significant portion of those were often this, undergrounding issue or discovering of a new area in which, for some reason, there was an impediment to delivering fiber, which would be good to understand. But there are potentially other reasons, and I have, no conduit, too much time, competitive loss. Somebody, Verizon came along, or Comcast or somebody else came along and offered a different service or a better service, or the customer just moved and gave up for some reason. But some version of coding all of those contacts and trying to understand, even at a high level, what percentage of them are successful and what are the major buckets for incompletion before closing, I think would probably help inform this discussion.
Yeah, one other quick comment there, Mark, is I think there's another one of the items that should be put in that list, which is customers who decided they weren't technically savvy enough to a la carte their service. Given that Concord Broadband only provides that data pipe, they would have had to go figure out, how am I going to solve my television? How am I going to solve my telephone? Maybe even the alarm system. Whereas Comcast says, I'll do it all for you. And maybe that's a consideration.
That could very well be. So what you're really pointing to is, for some reason, the service wasn't wasn't a match for what the customer wanted.
If I can add to that, we have to consider here, if we ever get broadband, of actually offering training classes to our residents on how to add to the service.
Mhm.
Because we're fearful that they wouldn't know how to add to the services.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just say, now that we arranged broadband, here's how you get TV.
Yeah.
Here's how you get broadcast television. Here's how you get a telephone service,
Right.
or have a Wi-Fi enabled cell phone, or other things of that nature.
Right.
I want to go back to one other thing. So Mark, I'm actually, this has been a good conversation. I think the proposed list that you provided in the agenda is a very good list. And at the best, we're going to differentiate from it. There is one thing that I wanted to call attention to here that I had a little concern about. Is somewhere in here it makes a comment that the data could be provided via PDF, I believe. I think we want to make sure that we get this in a form that we can import and do analysis and filtering on. So
Okay.
I think
I don't recall putting that in on purpose, but
let me see if I can find it. I maybe misspoke. I thought I read it. I'm trying to do too many things at once. Take notes and look at this.
okay.
Let me check again, and I'll get back to you.
Yeah, if you find out, if you come across it, let me know. But I would think that the formats would potentially, maps or visualizations of some kind could be useful. Other than that, spreadsheets or other, sort of machine readable data, I think are the two approaches.
I think that it's helpful, Scott. I'm sorry. It's helpful, Mark, to have this granular definition of the data fields.
Yeah.
But to keep it at the executive level, which is where we're at. I think that it's better. It's important. It's okay if you think granularly. I sure do. Is to think about what the win. How do we define a win? What would be the real, what could we do with it? What question are we trying to answer? And we've been developing these, so keep track of them, and those will go in the report.
Yeah, Gordon,
but keeping it a high level, I think, is probably better, because these guys are smart, and we're not gonna be running this operation, right? We're just trying to do a fact check and a sanity check, and maybe a bit of encouragement mid-course to keep us heading in the right direction.
Yeah, Mark, Gordon, I guess one thing I would say is I would not like to get in a position where we're asking them to provide the summary and synopsis of the data, but rather than the raw data, because we may choose, once we have it in our hands, to look at it a different way. And I don't want to have to keep going back to them to do it, nor do I want them to potentially have a bias about how that's generated. So I'd like to have it rather raw data than not.
Yeah. And I don't have a problem with that.
And Mark, I did find the reference. It says spreadsheet or other. And so if I were delivering something and I didn't really want to make it easy for the receiver to use it, I'd just deliver it in PDF in a way that couldn't be exported. And I'd rather say something along the lines of comma delimited, tab delimited, or XLS, be very explicit, because I don't.
Yes. Okay.
Or a SQL database. That'd be fine too. Listen, I think, we're talking about what the deliverable is. And I think that one of the gifts we could really give the light plant, both the board and the executive team, is a set of key takeaways. It's like, this is what will help you to keep an eye on, and this is the kind of data you need in order to do that. And Scott, you said a second ago about the growth wheel. It's like, there's a really important strategy that is actually in the back of everybody's minds, but it hasn't necessarily been executing super quickly. We're not climbing the growth curve super fast. But anyway, it's like, these are recommendations that are going to go to the light plant and go to the light board, and if we phrase this right, it's something they can carry forward. And this,
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
we're gonna disband. So it's about ways of
Right.
thinking
And
about
that's,
things. What kind of data do you need to think about this problem correctly? And then take it from here, guys.
yeah. And that belongs in our report, not in the request for data.
True.
So, I mean, this is the request of data for which we will start to write a report. I've been, I think one of the things we might want to do once we're over this hump of these requests for data is to begin to think about at least the outline of how we would want to report out. And this is something for a follow-on meeting, which is, just basically, what is it in a very broad brush way? How do we want to organize our commentary to them? And then that may help us make sure that we're doing the right thing, sort of working it from the backwards.
Yeah. Good. I'm anticipating that there's a reasonable possibility that some of this data may either be unavailable or incomplete. Things like, why did whatever percentage of people who submitted a request form not finish may very well turn out to be a data set that needs some work, and we may need to have a discussion about whether or not it's appropriate to do some sort of follow-up, and if so, who could do that task. I like where you were going when you mentioned what are the gifts we could leave. I think it is mostly about thinking about what's going on in this process and what would be useful to track over time to both encourage, to meet some long range goals that I think we would be encouraging be set, and to sort of think about how to know that progress is being made. Even something like as simple as saying, okay, we think that there should be some completion codes that are applied to these things that say this customer canceled because our perception is that they needed TV and we don't have it, or whatever those things are, because that's useful information for future decision makers, not us. But it's still very useful to
it is interesting, though. There's a parallelism between the data definition, the data request process that we're walking through right now, and what I envision the light plant needing to do on a continual basis.
Right.
A lot of those questions are the same, or a lot of the data pulls are the same,
Yeah.
and a lot of the missing data.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, so we may not get the missing data in the context of this time period, right? It's just not enough time. So we say, hey, look, you guys would do a lot better if you fill in these gaps.
Yeah, I would say the flip. Oh, I'm sorry, Gail. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I just was wondering, do we want to know like what the light plans, or what the fiber folks' current plans are for building out? I mean, like, they must have some plan, I don't know. I'm assuming they have some kind of plan. So
Yeah,
and maybe we should.
And I'm not the one to speak for them, but I've heard that discussed over the past 5 years or so that I've been on the committee, on the light board, and it's basically an iterative process where you if they need more people to apply, they can maybe advertise a bit, but they're prioritizing the easiest ones to install at the lowest price. I mean, Mark, you know way more about it than I have, but that's you're just taking as it goes, and it's gotten us pretty well so far.
So I have a recommendation here. Currently, the only metrics that appears to be monitored, and please, anyone, Gordon or Mark, you guys would know better than me, but it seems as if the only metric that we're currently monitoring is the number of subscribers. And that's it. It may be that part of our recommendation in this report is a few other metrics. We don't have to get overly complicated about it, that they might want to monitor and then the other thing that might be very suitable, I know that the light board has promised to have a conversation during every board meeting around broadband, but more suitable either every quarter or every 6 months, they have kind of a business review, a more in-depth review of the broadband. And, you know, maybe that's the point which they kind of touch the controls, if you will. Maybe we need to up the rate of installation because we have, our backlog has grown, or maybe there's other considerations or other things that come across it. But maybe those kinds of things would be part of our recommendation. Again, we're getting kind of to the report piece. We're not talking about the data gathering.
Well, I think understanding that the true goal, I mean, we started this based on Article 41, and I would say that the goal that the town meeting actually asked us to try to clarify, I think both in terms of how to get there and whether it's feasible, is can we get fiber to 100% of the town? And you know, I think that's a good place to start in trying to answer that question. And so in service of that, first identifying exactly where it isn't, so that we know what's left in the to-do pile, and then trying to understand how to get there is the only goals that we typically ran against were, we had an idea of how many subscriptions we were trying to achieve, how many new subscribers, you know, net adds to the subscriber base we were looking for year over year. And you can go a fair distance on that. But I think what happened was, it was easy to achieve those goals without ever addressing the problem of what about all the people who are in the service area who simply, the answer is we can't, we don't go there right now. And I think the town is saying, well, maybe we can do a little better than that. Maybe there should be a goal that says, how do you add fiber capability to areas that are not served, so that everybody has an equal opportunity to take the service or not.
And once again, Mark, as you well know, when we worked that model, that was by design,
Oh, yeah. It was a practical solution, but at this stage of the game, with an entity that is currently generating profits, I think it is sensible to say, okay, what's the policy decision? The overarching. I mean, if we went back to what was presented at town meeting, certainly the authorization that I felt when I presented that at town meeting, it was, go ahead and do this, but please don't fail. Don't lose the town money, just be successful. That's good. 7 years later, success. Now what?
Well, and
success.
I think there's some risk that if we push this too hard, you could actually mess that up.
That's
and
true.
For instance, I said, hey, look, it's like how many solar panels we have to install across all of Concord in order to provide all of Concord's electricity. It wouldn't work. Okay, so you just got to be careful. And I think this is where I think getting the right numbers up front, maybe I'm wrong. I don't know until I see the numbers.
Yeah.
Well,
one other way to think about it is that we're going to come up with a list of unserved parcels. I guess that's the term we're talking about. Then the question will be, what would be the cost to serve those unserved parcels? And they include Concord Green, they include Kais Road, they include these streets that we've just discussed. And for each of those, we perhaps would be able to assign a rough order of magnitude cost of serving them. Then the final part is, and this could be part of our recommendation, how might you fund that? And there is where, the infrastructure bill in the federal government level, increased revenue from increased subscriptions and other things might come into play. So that's kind of the order I see it in. First, define the problem in terms of the parcels. Second, what would it cost for each one of those parcels to be served? And then third, how we might we pay for those? And it may be that there's some 2% at the end, the long tail, that would cost $500,000 a piece to serve, and maybe we'll never do it. There may be some in that category. We don't know until we get there. So,
well, and also there's an equity piece too. It's like who pays for it? If there's like a $50,000 trenching cost,
Mhm.
to run something, you know, a quarter of a mile or a mile or something down some back road or something. You know, who pays for that? The resident or the business or us?
Yeah,
And
let's see
early on, it's residences have been paying relatively modest trenching fees. But I could imagine as we climb that growth circle, which I love that analogy that you used, Scott, that might generate enough revenue that we could afford to tackle some of the hard cases. But would that be fair to the people that paid out of pocket early on?
Well,
I
I
don't know.
mean, so I have a comment about that. First of all, I struck a deal when I signed up for Concord Broadband, and we are holding to that deal, meaning I've agreed to pay a certain amount a month plus my deposit to get it started, and life is good. Whether they chose to take the profits, you know, is it my business that they take the profits and do two things? First of all, pay back the commitment to the town, the lending that Mark and I, you know, authorized and I supported. Once having done that, I think that's somewhere incumbent over time to deal with that. If they take the free cash or the cash flow coming out of this entity and apply it to expand their business, that's not my call as an individual subscriber. And I'll give you a complete, I used to work for Amazon Robotics. And so Amazon, this is public knowledge, so I'm not giving anything away, in the United States throws off a tremendous amount of profit from their fulfillment side of their business, not the AWS side. They don't do so overseas. That doesn't throw off. So they take their money from the United States profits and invest it in the overseas fulfillment business. That's their business. Every time I buy from Amazon, you know, I'm just dealing with my transaction with Amazon. And I think this is somewhat the same thing here. How we run it as a business, as long as we're keeping the town whole, is it really, you know, that's the way I would look at it anyway.
Sure.
Yeah, that gets into a section that I think we'll want to have a dedicated meeting on, is it really talks about the capital allocation and the financial policies. I think that it's, my humble opinion is it's squarely in the purview of the light board, maybe guided by the select board, to actually establish those policies. I think it's certainly useful for us to articulate what sorts of decisions might be made there. Like, you know, even a very simple high level policy, like, is there a commitment to get fiber to 100% of the premises or not? And how far does that commitment go? I think that all of us, myself included, when faced with the reality that we'd only actually gotten to 80%, I felt disappointed in that. That was something that I literally worked on this for a while and didn't understand. And I think that you know, there's 20% of the citizenry who are, you know, paying taxes and living in this community who simply don't have access, and I think they should. And I think that as it becomes financially feasible to do that, that should be addressed. That's my opinion.
If I can just add a thought, and I kind of look at it differently. It's not that we don't have an alternative. It's not that the town's not providing water or electricity or sewage disposal. There is an alternative out there.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not a, I mean, people talk about this as if it's a public, it's a living need. And someone's expressed that last week in public comments. We have an alternative to, I mean, I say this intellectually, not as a position, so bear with me. There are alternatives to the service that the town offers.
Mm-hmm.
And we can't choose water, we can't choose electricity, we can't choose our sewage system, but there are choices out there. And I happen to think, and this I do believe, that there's a point where the town's going to, the CMLP is going to have to take a position of benign neglect. You're not going to be able to service 100% of the town. And I'm okay with it.
There's, you know, Dave,
let's let Gordon go.
Sure.
Just to ask a question, Mark, when you say 100%, I think this is an important question. Are we asking, does 100% represent actual fiber to 100% of the homes in the same sense as David just described for electricity or water? Or does 100% mean that any house that wants to install this service can get it after a reasonable implementation period?
My answer to that is that it could be either. I think it's important to actually decide what that answer actually is in the context of CMLP and the town, and make, have an explicit policy over it. In other words, I would like to see the option available to 100%. Water, you can sink your own well if you don't want to be connected to the town water in most parts of town. Obviously, there are some parts where maybe you can't. I don't know all those regulations. The sewer system, you're required to hook up in some parts of town, and most of us actually are not connected to the sewer system. The electric, there's a different policy for electrification. The CMLP is actually required to serve within its service area because electricity is considered a utility. And but in all, sewer, you could argue that it's either do it yourself or use the town, but water, do it yourself or use the town. But there are alternatives to the telecommunications. So it's a policy decision for one provider, just like Verizon or Comcast or anybody else can decide whether or not they're willing to serve a particular customer or not. CMLP has that decision to make, and should make that decision, and should instantiate that in a policy. Yes, Scott.
Yeah, so two things. First of all, think about trash service. This is a perfect example. It is optional. If we were looking for an analogy, that would be one to think about. I actually had another thought. This one is actually, unfortunately, a little scary. If we are successful in gathering up all but the last 10 or 5% of town of Concord through the broadband, do we risk the possibility that Comcast and or Verizon just simply turns their back on the town because the number of customers is so sparse, forcing us to turn around and cover those 5 to 10%? This is sort of you see my question? I know it's kind of an oddball question, but I wonder if that's something, now the flip side of that is when we talked to, what was it, Braintree, or I think it was, that has their own broadband, they cohabitated with both Verizon, Fios, and Comcast, and by and large split it 3 ways. The input that we got from them was, we have a certain number of people that leave, a certain number of people that come back, some that come and go because they try and negotiate for special deals and they'll actually make changes. But at the end of the day, when all the dust settled, they by and large split it 3 ways, right, across the town, between the Braintree services, which included content and included telephone and email, which is something we chose not to do, and Comcast and Verizon Fios, who are all able to play in the same marketplace there. So it may be, so there's a couple questions there, and I just wanted to make that comment. But the one that was actually more disturbing to me was, if we get it to a point where we've been successful, are we going to create a situation where Comcast just disengages from the town?
Gordon, you had a comment?
Before you came on, Scott, I asked nearly the same question, the first question of Carlin Reed. And I was wondering, if we really increase the deployment of Concord's broadband against Comcast's Xfinity service, would that in any way threaten their business model, or at least to the extent that it would lower the payments, the subsidy payments that we get for our, the town TV? And she said she didn't think it would. And so I just thought that was an interesting answer. And the one point that she pointed to support that view is that a lot of people will continue to get their TV from Comcast, regardless of where they get the broadband.
Yeah, this would actually be a very interesting number to know, if there's customers that have both Concord Light broadband and Comcast. I would be surprised if that number was very large at all.
It'd be difficult to get that number.
No, I know that. And one
Again,
this,
like, your analogy of the trash service is pretty good. It's like there are multiple, providers who are willing to provide trash service, and they split the market. And that's likely to happen in this case too. Just because fiber is available doesn't mean it is. My sense of it is there's actually quite a bit of research out there that suggests that in markets like it was Braintree that you were describing, where there are actually more than one viable offering for, legitimate full service offering for telecom services, those customers get lower prices and better rates. In as close as, Somerville and Cambridge is, if you follow that debate, Somerville has multiple providers and they pay on average substantially less than Cambridge, which is dominated by one supplier. So my view, and I've said this in front of town meeting and we're happy to repeat it here, is that being a viable competition for places even like Concord Green, like I don't know how much micro-targeting they do, but where there's an option, I, get offers from our competitive provider in my mailbox every week to go switch, and in theory could, save a few dollars for 12 months if I wanted to. And I think that's a good thing. And so my view is we want to serve 100, we want to be able to serve as much as possible, as close to 100% as is practical. And that will lead to whatever percentage actually gets Concord Light Broadband will pay a fair price, and everybody else will also pay a competitive price. And that is good for the economy of the town and contributes to sustainability and so forth. And I happen to believe that the fiber also augments the operations of the light plant in some important ways that have to do with electric utility, which is an important consideration for why to do this as well. And, I would submit that overlooking 20%, the Concord Greens of the world actually sub-optimizes the electric service too, if we were to look into it from that perspective.
Well, Mark, I think I just heard you say the strong 100%. And I think it might be useful for the group to sort of have like a shorthand for what these different definitions are. I just use the word one. There's like a 100% and strong 100%.
I said close to 100%.
Okay. Well, and wait, no. Just the point that the question that I asked you before is definitional.
Yeah.
Right. And because Carlin told us at the last meeting that Comcast actually has a carrier requirement. They actually have a legal obligation to provide broadband to whoever asks for it. That does not fall on us.
That's because that's what their franchise agreement says.
Yeah. So now we've got 3 different definitions of complete rollout. So it's good. I think if we could develop a vocabulary to refer to these and keep them straight in our minds when we're discussing them. But what I just heard you say is the strong 100%, which is broadband to every home. And I think that is the definition that you feel was endorsed by Article 41, would have a side benefit in terms of supporting light plant activities, right? And so that's great. And that's not supported by those weaker definitions of 100%.
Yeah. And what I mean by that is fiber potentially available to 100% of residential and business properties, premises. And so there's two overarching barriers that we've discussed today. We've spent some time on it's simply not built there. You can't get there from here problem. And then the second one, which is a different flavor of that, and I tried to articulate it to some extent under letter C in our document that we worked on last week, which is what happens when there's some third-party intermediary. You've got a business owner or a resident of a multi-dwelling unit who is there because with a landlord or as part of some, group cooperative that owns the property, and that group, that intermediary, is actually standing between Concord Light and the customer who would like to have the service but can't because they don't have the resources or they don't have the authorization. That's a whole second set of problems, which I believe we are covering under letter C for this, and has a different set of solutions, mostly programmatic or legal types of solutions that are not the same as can we just get the fiber there, right?
Actually, so I guess I just want to confirm or restate, the goal of all this is to make sure that we can get fiber available to 100% of the properties in town, right? The addresses in town, not that we get a subscription anywhere near that rate.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
Yeah,
there could be a dark fiber definition where we get at least dark fiber to every home and they don't
Yeah.
have to light it up. So to me, that's a definition.
Maybe
of
that's
the-
not, I'm going to stop you on the definition because you say to every home. I would say just use the terminology of passing. So the passing cost. So essentially we would say fiber is passing the edge, some edge of their property as an availability, not to actually bring it into, we're not going to put the demarc and pull a wire into the house if they're not going to subscribe. But at the very at least passing every lot, every parcel, every address, which I was very excited to hear, Mark, I describe this address database, which is really the ultimate goal of this is, every last apartment, any dwelling that has a mailing address, that's what we want to be able to serve.
Gail?
Yeah, so I think when I was drafting Article 41, the reason I started with letter A was getting the fiber to 100% of the streets. That's what I meant by completion. Like I didn't want someone to have to be told no, you can't have it because it doesn't pass your house. So to me, that's the definition of 100%. I mean, it'd be fabulous if we could get the fiber to every single home and business, and we can certainly have recommendations for that in the report, but I don't think that's as much of a goal as like getting it to pass the property.
And if we implement that, then we could actually take on a commitment to say, hey, look, if you want it, we'll give it to you. It won't take very long because we've already run it down your street. And then that would enable one of these softer definitions of 100%.
Yeah, I mean, you could come out with, so let's say there's 56 of these properties, and just for the sake of argument, we know it's not true, all 56 were the same size project, and the goal could be in 10 years we're going to get done. That means 5.6 of these streets need to be cabled up every year. Is that going to happen? Probably not, but it's a way of thinking about the problem, at least the definition of how long does it take to get done, and what and then so somebody could do the math of how much construction is that and how much does it cost, and figure out how long it would take to pay for it based on the goal, the how much cash is available through the business or how much borrowing. But those are all decisions that can then be made once a programmatic goal is set. Okay.
I just had a thought, and I do not know if we want to put this analysis, do it or can do it or put it in, but let's just say for conversation's sake that these 56 streets, let's just say to round numbers and to have a conversation, there were 10 homes on each case. And we know that out of those 10 homes, based on the current installed base, that we would only get 20% of them or 30% of them to sign up. So that's 3 homes for each one of those. Working backwards in that way, very same way, we might actually come to a number that says if it costs more than so many dollars, the return on that and building out that street might go to infinity or near infinite time. And does that matter? And now I'm going to answer my own question. I think the answer is no, it doesn't. Because what we want to do is aggregate that across the entire town. We want to fund the hard to reach places from those places that were easy to reach. So never mind. I apologize for the description.
I think especially when we start to think about who might be living in it. The street level is a little more complicated because it's more a function of geography and construction technique. But I think when we look at the addresses and realize that it's probably not the high, it's probably skews lower income and so forth. And there's a bunch of moral reasons to at least set the bar a little bit more in favor of, there's a public good associated with making sure that it's at least available.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Because what
Okay.
happens is every
Right. It can't just
provider,
be, it won't be a pure business decision. You're right.
yeah,
So
and every provider that ever does this, especially those that are motivated by the economics, are going to end up serving the same areas and not serving the same other areas.
Yeah.
And that's kind of not okay.
yeah, I
Well,
mean, I think
just
to
looking
the
at-
extent that the contract that we have with Comcast forced them to service everyone is a perfect model
Mhm.
in that regard.
Except that it may not be safe for us to embrace that, because look at, like, I pay a $300 or $200 Comcast bill,
Mhm.
right? So they could afford, the Comcast service generates a lot more cash
Mhm.
than Concord Broadband is ever going to, unless
Yes.
we take on those other services. So
Mhm.
anyway.
We did look at those other services, and unless you're at a much larger scale, it doesn't actually pay to do it.
All
it's
I'm
also
saying is
delivered
that's a quick and dirty explanation of why it is that Comcast is able to cover the whole town in a way that we haven't yet, and that we just need to be cognizant as we try and push this forward.
But their franchise agreement forced them to, that was their price of entry when we were negotiating with them, right?
Although
said-
over time, it can be accomplished. And our cost of delivery for Concord Light Broadband is also lower.
True. So
Right.
it's
So-
just the overhead,
yeah.
the trenching and all that.
Sure.
Especially because we started at a later hour tonight. I'm, going to go with our 90-minute rule, and I see we're at about 10 to 15 minutes left on that. So I feel like we have gotten some agreement that the things I've listed under data requests make sense for an initial request to town staff. I've listed some next steps below that. Other data collection that we might want to do is whether there's any experts that, any other public input that we might want to get that's not part of this data that the town actually has, whether there's publication or, and to your point earlier, Gordon, staff reports that they might, we should certainly invite the staff to comment on what we're doing. And then I do think we need to pivot, and we've already started doing that, talking about how do we articulate the goals that are set, that are implied by the solutions, and then what are the policies that might pursue that. And then I think we need to get down to report writing. We're sitting here almost halfway through, or a quarter of the way through October, with really a small number of weeks left, I think 10 weeks or so. So we're going to have to begin to format what our results are going to need to be. Gail's point earlier about, A being, the streets and the construction of the streets, I think is very useful for us to think in terms of is what's the deliverable that really needs to make it in time for a report to this town meeting versus maybe some of these other things that could be, could be a roadmap to a solution for future work, even, could be picked up by another group or continued on this group if we were invited to do so. So that we probably want to have some conversation about that as well. Okay.
Mark, would you entertain a motion or two here? I guess I would move that we proceed with the current outlined data request as described in the agenda, with one edit to change the format to be make sure it's machine readable and parsable, be it comma delimited, that the chair move forward with making those requests and having the conversation with the light plant Greg at the light plant about any other data that might be available easily.
Okay.
That's my motion.
All right, and if you want to ask me to take point on trying to get that done, I'm willing to do that.
Sounds good.
Do I hear a second? Gail is trying to second.
That's the second.
Okay. So Scott, you're the clerk, so you can call a roll for any more discussion on that before we have a vote. Okay, Scott, call a roll for a vote.
Okay, Mark,
Aye.
Gail,
Aye.
David,
I,
Scott, yes.
And Gordon?
Gordon,
Aye.
sorry, Gordon, didn't mean to forget you.
Okay.
Trying to
Great.
type and talk at the same time.
Great.
Okay.
Okay.
Would you entertain a motion to finish the meeting, or do you want to talk? Oh, we have public
Well,
comment too.
Is
Yeah.
there anything in specifically that you guys want to plan to discuss next Thursday in particular? Okay. So if not, I will open the floor for public comments. We'll have a status of the data request, and I'm going to suggest that next Thursday's meeting will focus on beginning to set some goals and what we're going to do with this information, which we probably won't have yet, but we'll have asked for. Okay, comments? Harlan?
I'm willing to defer to Terry because I went first last time.
I
Go ahead, Terry.
purposely didn't raise my hand yet.
Okay, I have a quick thing. In today's Boston Globe, there's an article called "From Broadband to Home Building to a State-Owned Bank." The Senate outlines its priorities for post-pandemic Massachusetts. And there's a reference to a digital equity fund. If you haven't read that article, it's pretty good because it talks about how there's a proposal to have the Senate panel to expand public broadband subsidies for low-income residents to create this digital equity fund. And that would provide grants to cities, nonprofits, and advocacy groups that are trying to improve broadband access. Now, I don't know if anything will come of it, but there's at least an indication that there's another data point for funding broadband expansion. That's it.
Thank you, Carlin.
Carlin, if you would send me the link or any information about the article, I'll try and find it. I have an account.
Sure, I'll send
I'll
it
put
out
it in the
right now.
minutes. Yeah.
I'll send it to you now.
Thank you.
All right, thanks.
Carlin, I would also like to get a copy of that, just if you could CC me on that too, thanks.
Sure.
I just
Yeah,
want to
the
say
problem-
how impressed I am with this committee. I think you've gotten an awful lot done already. And I didn't know what to expect when we first created it. And each one of you has a different expertise that's really working together really well. Like Gordon, your knowledge of the current CMLPs is really proving to be very useful, and Scott's background, and David with your HOA, everybody, it's really coming together. Thanks so much, guys. Really appreciate it. I think we're gonna get a lot done with this.
Thank you, Terry.
Thanks.
Any other comments before we take a motion to adjourn? Okay, and I'm inclined to revert to 6:30 next week, just because I know I'm a little fresher then, especially towards the end. Okay, great. So we'll go back to our regularly scheduled time. All right. Do I hear a motion to adjourn?
I move we adjourn.
Second.
Okay. And
I'll do the rail call. Mark,
aye.
Gail,
Aye.
David,
I.
Gordon,
Aye.
Scott, yes.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. I
Thank
think
you.